So the first part of writing your data analysis is to make a plan for data collection. So we're going to go back to the question and the hypothesis, as well as the procedure, to figure out what our plan is going to be to collect the data that shows how the height of the cupcakes relates to the amount of baking powder. So looking at the scientific question again, it is, how does the amount of baking powder affect the height of the cupcake? So looking at your question, think about the things that are measured in here. So I see the amount of baking powder, right? And if we go to our instructions, there are amounts of 0. This one has 0 teaspoons of baking powder. And then we're going to repeat for these amounts. So we definitely need to work in 0 teaspoons, a quarter teaspoon, a half teaspoon, 1 teaspoon, and 2 teaspoons into our data somehow. I'm right now just kind of brainstorming, what do I need to write into my data plan? The other thing that I see is the height of the cupcake. So definitely I need some kind of table to record this, to record the height. And along with the height, I'm going to have to label those with the different amounts of baking powder. I will go back to my instructions again. So there's my heights right there, recording the height. I've got these things listed for the baking powder. And I also want to work in here some trials. And I see that I don't have my trials in here. And maybe I want to put in here, instead of each, 5 cupcake wells, so that we're making 5 cupcakes. So here, when I measure the height of the batter, it's going to be for each of the 5 cupcakes. Okay, so I know that I need to build in these trials in here. So I'm going to make a note that I will have 5 cupcakes, each amount of baking powder. So now that I've made some notes around my scientific question after looking at my instructions, I'm going to use my notes to write my data collection plan. So I'll go to my paper now, and I'll start typing up my plan by looking back here. And I want to mention that, first of all, I'm going to change the amounts of baking powder. So I can say something like, for each amount of baking powder, I'll list the amounts: 0 teaspoons, 1/4 teaspoon, 1/2 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon, 2 teaspoons. The height of the cupcakes will be measured with a ruler in centimeters. I want to be specific about what I'm doing. And the height will be measured before and after baking. Finally, we have to build in some kind of trials. So I'm going to just label this trials. For each amount of baking powder, 5 cupcakes will be baked with exactly the same recipe. I also want to mention my control here. So the control will be the cakes with 0 teaspoons of baking powder. So now we will set up a sample data table that will hold the measurements and the data that is collected in the plan. So I'm going to make a table, and I know I need at least 5 trials for my 5 cupcakes. I need to measure the height before and after for each amount of baking powder. So I'm first going to make a table for the control, the 0 teaspoons. So I'll insert a table, and I know I need at least 5 trials with a header row and then before and after. So there's my table. So I'm going to label these as my trials. And this is going to be for 0 teaspoons of baking powder. So let me list each of my cupcake trials here. So cupcake 1, cupcake 2, cupcake 3, cupcake 4, cupcake 5. Okay, so I have my 5 cupcake trials there. And then I know I need to measure the height before baking, and that will be in centimeters. And then I will measure the height after baking, again in centimeters. So there's my sample data table for my 0 teaspoons of baking powder. Now, you're probably thinking, but I have to do this for other amounts. So instead of making all of the data tables, we're just going to explain here for each amount of baking powder, a similar table to record the data would be made. There would be a total of 5 tables, 1 for each amount of baking powder. And that's how you would complete how to make the sample data tables. So the last step in your data analysis is to explain how the data in these sample data tables would be analyzed. So I'm first going to need to figure out from the height before baking and the height after baking how much the cupcake actually rose. So I explain what I do to calculate the actual height that the cupcakes rose here. So I say to subtract the height of the cupcake before baking from the height of the cupcake after baking. Then I talk about how to record these calculated heights in another column, and then how to find the average height for the 5 cupcakes. Once I do that, I talk about how am I going to relate the amount of baking powder to the actual average heights that the cupcakes rose. And so that typically you'd make some kind of chart or graph. So I talk about the chart or graph that could be made, and then what relationship that I would expect to see from the amount of baking powder and the heights. In summary, here are the key steps of writing your data analysis. First, make a detailed data collection plan. Write out the details. Number 2, create sample data tables. And then finally, in 3, explain how the data would be analyzed and what you would expect the analysis to show.